Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're going to be tackling Kent Beck's latest book, Tidy First, a personal exercise in empirical software design. While you guys have sent over excerpts, reviews, even some deep technical dives on this, it's quite the stack of material.
It is.
Our goal today is to kind of sift through it all
and
extract the nuggets that will be most valuable for you.
It's exciting to see a book that doesn't just tell you how to refactor, but really tackles the more nuanced question of when.
Absolutely.
And I think that's where things get really interesting, especially for folks who are, already down the road a bit in programming.
So let's start with the core concept, tidy first.
Yeah.
The book emphasizes these small, focused refactorings or tidyings as a way to improve code readability and make future changes easier. I'm curious, for someone who might be skeptical, why is this approach so powerful? Isn't it just rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic if the underlying design is flawed?
That's a great question, and I think the book actually addresses that head on. Think of it this way. Even with a flawed design, you still have to work with the code, right? Every time you make a change, you're essentially navigating a maze. And what Tidy First is about is clearing the path, making the maze easier to navigate.
Okay.
Even if you can't redesign the whole thing from scratch.
I see the value in that.
Yeah.
But is it just about making the code look better? Or are there deeper benefits?
There are definitely deeper benefits. One of the most important is reducing what's called cognitive load.
Oh, yeah.
Imagine you're trying to debug a complex function, right? You're juggling variables, tracing execution paths. You're trying to hold it all in your head at once.
Yeah.
It's mentally exhausting.
Oh, tell me about it. I've been there staring at the screen for hours, wondering what on earth I was thinking when I wrote this code.
Exactly. And that's where I think tidyings come in, by making small incremental improvements to the code structure. What you're essentially doing is reducing the mental effort required to understand it and work with it. You're clearing out the clutter, so to speak, so you can focus on that essential logic.
So it's like decluttering your workspace. A tidy desk helps you think more clearly.
Right.
But doesn't this take extra time?
Sure.
Especially when deadlines are looming.
That's a very common concern, I think. But the book argues that tidying actually saves you time in the long run. Think of it as an investment.
Okay.
You spend a little time up front to make the code easier to work with, and that pays off in terms of, reduced debugging time, faster feature development, fewer errors down the line.
Interesting. It's like spending time sharpening your tools before you start a big project. It might seem like a delay, but it actually makes the work go faster and smoother.
Exactly. And the book goes even deeper, connecting tidying to economic concepts like the time value of money. Have you ever heard that term?
That caught my eye, too. Time value of money in software design.
Yeah.
It seems like a stretch.
Yeah, it might seem that way, but it's actually a very powerful analogy. Think about it. Technical debt, those messy parts of the code that, we all have, that we know we should fix, but we keep putting off the accrue interest over time.
Right.
The longer we wait to address them, the more complex and costly they become to fix.
Okay, that makes sense. So by tidying up early and often, we're essentially paying down that technical debt before it spirals out of control.
Precisely. And that's where the concept of optionality comes in.
Okay.
Tidying keeps our options open for future changes. It's like building a house with a flexible floor plan, right? You can easily adapt it to changing needs as your family grows or your lifestyle evolves.
So tidy code is like a modular house. I like that.
Exactly. And that modularity, that adaptability is crucial in software development. The more flexible and maintainable our code is, the more options we have for how to evolve it over time. And, and that translates to real business value.
Okay. I'm starting to see the bigger picture here. But let's get down to brass tacks. The book is packed with specific tidyings. Can you give us a taste of the ones that really stand out?
Absolutely. One that I find particularly powerful is the use of guard clauses.
Okay.
Imagine you have a function with a complex set of conditions, right?
Right.
Instead of nesting those conditions layer upon layer, creating this maze of if-else statements, you use guard clauses to check those conditions up front and exit early if they're not met.
So it's like setting clear boundaries at the start instead of letting things get tangled up in the middle.
Exactly. And this makes the code so much easier to read and understand. It's like having a clear roadmap before venturing into a dense forest.
Makes sense. It's all about clarity and reducing that cognitive load we talked about.
Right.
Now, there's one tidying that seems almost too simple, but the book really emphasizes it. Deleting dead code. I mean, isn't that just common sense? Why is it so crucial from a design perspective?
It's crucial because dead code isn't just harmless clutter. You know it can actually be a breeding ground for bugs. Imagine you're trying to fix a bug, and you stumble across a piece of code that looks relevant. You spend hours tracing through it only to realize it's not even being used.
Oh, yeah.
That's wasted time and effort.
Oh, I've definitely fallen into that trap before. Spent way too long trying to debug something that wasn't even running.
And the problem is dead code can also mislead developers about the system's behavior.
Oh.
You know, it's like having outdated maps, right? You might think you're heading in the right direction, but you end up lost and confused.
So deleting dead code is like decluttering those maps, making sure we're always working with the most accurate and relevant information.
Precisely. And it also clarifies the structure of the system.
Okay.
By removing those unused parts, the remaining code becomes easier to understand and work with.
Makes sense. It's like pruning a tree. You remove the dead branches to allow the healthy ones to flourish.
I like that analogy. Now, another tidying that I think often has a big impact is what he calls normalizing symmetries. This is about recognizing patterns in your code and making them consistent.
So if you're doing something similar in multiple places, do it the same way every time.
Exactly. For instance, let's say you're working with lazily initialized variables, right?
Right.
You know, make sure they're handled the same way throughout your code base. This consistency just makes the code more predictable and easier to reason about.
It's like having a universal language for your code. Everyone knows what to expect, which reduces the chances of miscommunication and errors.
Precisely. And the book provides many other examples of these small targeted tidyings that can cumulatively have a huge impact on the overall design of your software.
It's amazing how these seemingly minor tweaks can add up to something so significant. But I'm curious, what about those situations where we need to make bigger changes?
Sure.
Not just small tidings. Does tidy first still apply?
It absolutely does. In fact, the book has a specific technique called new interface, old implementation, that's particularly useful when you need to refactor a clunky piece of code, but you can't do it all at once.
Yeah, it's a brilliant way to manage risk and avoid, those big bang refactorings that can break everything.
Right.
So let's say you have a function with a messy interface. Instead of diving in and changing it all at once, you create a new interface,
Okay.
the one you wish you had, and then you simply implement it by calling the old function.
So you're essentially creating a facade, a more user-friendly front end for that messy back-end code.
Exactly. And this gives you a few advantages, right?
Mm-hmm.
First, you can start using the new interface right away, even though the implementation is still using the old code. Second, you can gradually migrate other parts of the system to use the new interface, one step at a time. And finally, once everything is migrated, you can often inline that old implementation and get rid of it altogether.
It's like a stealthy refactoring mission. You're sneaking in those improvements under the radar. But I'm thinking about all these mini tidyings.
Yeah. And it seems like it could get overwhelming to manage them all.
Yeah.
How do we keep track of them, make sure they get done, and avoid those massive pull requests that make reviewers groan?
That's where the rhythm of tidying comes in, right?
Okay.
It's not about spending hours on end just tidying. It's about weaving it into your everyday workflow, finding a balance between, tidying and making those behavior changes. The book suggests thinking of it like a cycle. Mm-hmm. You tidy for a short period, just enough to enable the next behavior change. Then you make that change and repeat.
So it's not a separate task.
Right.
It's integrated into the flow development.
Exactly.
I like that.
Yeah.
But how do we avoid those awkward code reviews where someone says, what's the point of this tiny change? It doesn't actually do anything.
That's a real challenge, and I think the book provides some specific strategies.
Okay.
One is to be very intentional about how you present your tidyings and pull requests. Instead of lumping them in with behavior changes, create separate pull requests for each tidying or a small related set of tidyings. And crucially, explain the why behind the tidying in the pull request description. Don't just say renamed variable.
Yeah.
Explain why the old name was confusing or misleading and how the new name improves clarity.
So we need to be advocates for our tidyings, make the value clear to the reviewers.
Absolutely. It's about educating the team and fostering a culture where tidying is valued. And sometimes that might even mean skipping code reviews altogether for those tiny, non-controversial tidyings.
Hold on, no code reviews.
Yeah.
Isn't that a bit risky?
It can be, but it's a trade-off. The book suggests that for teams with a high level of trust and a strong culture of quality.
Okay.
Eliminating code reviews for tidyings can significantly speed up development without sacrificing code quality. Of course, this requires clear guidelines and a shared understanding of what constitutes a safe tidying.
So it's a powerful option for teams that can pull it off. But even with smaller pull requests, we still need to manage how much tidying we do before integrating and deploying. How do we find that sweet spot?
That's where the concept of batch size comes in.
Okay.
The book talks about finding the right balance between doing too few tidings per batch and doing too many.
Right.
Too few, and you're constantly context switching, losing that flow state, right?
Right.
Too many, and you increase the risk of collisions, those merge conflicts that can make you want to tear your hair out.
Ugh, merge conflicts. The bane of every developer's existence.
Exactly. And on top of collisions, large batches of tidings also increase the risk of accidentally changing the behavior of the code. It's easier to make a mistake when you're doing a lot of small changes all at once.
Right. So smaller batches are generally better.
In an ideal world, yes. But the reality is many organizations have a lot of overhead involved in getting even a single change through review and deployment.
Right.
So, developers naturally lean towards larger batches to avoid that constant back and forth.
It's that age-old tension between speed and quality.
It is. But here's the good news. There are ways to reduce that review and deployment overhead.
Right.
Which then allows us to work with smaller batches and get all the benefits of frequent integration. Right.
Okay.
Fewer merge conflicts, faster feedback, and a more agile development process.
I like where this is going. So it's not just about the individual tidyings. It's about optimizing the whole development workflow to make tidying a seamless part of the process. But I want to circle back to those tidyings themselves. The book is packed with specific techniques. Can you give us some more examples that really highlight the power of tidy first?
Absolutely. Let's start with one that can be a bit controversial. Comments.
Ooh, comments, the great debate. I'm ready to hear where Kent Beck stands on this one.
Yeah, everyone seems to have very strong opinions about comments. The book takes a nuanced approach, right? It emphasizes using comments strategically to bridge the gap between what the code says and what it means.
Okay.
It's about capturing the why behind the code, the reasoning and context that might not be immediately obvious from the code itself.
Because sometimes even our own code can look like a foreign language a few weeks later.
Exactly. So the book encourages us to write comments that explain the intent of the code, the thought process behind it, the decisions that were made. Imagine you're the future reader of this code. What would you want to know? What would make your life easier?
It's like leaving breadcrumbs for our future selves, or for anyone else who might stumble upon this code later on.
Right, and those breadcrumbs can be lifesavers, especially when dealing with complex logic or tricky edge cases. A well-placed comment can prevent hours of head-scratching and misinterpretation.
Sure.
But on the flip side, we also need to be ruthless about deleting redundant comments.
Ah, yes. Those comments that just restate what the code already says.
Exactly. Like, this function calculates the sum of two numbers. If the function is called calculateSum, that comment isn't adding any value, it's just clutter.
Less is more when it comes to effective comments. But what about those situations where the code is so convoluted that it's hard to even start tidying? Where do you even begin?
That's where the book suggests a somewhat counterintuitive move. One pile.
One pile.
Yeah, sometimes to make sense of a mess, you need to embrace it, at least temporarily.
Wait, so you're saying we should just pile all that messy code into one giant blob? Sounds like a recipe for disaster.
Not a giant blob, exactly, but the idea is to strategically inline functions and methods, bringing all that scattered logic into one central location.
It's like taking apart a clock to see how all the gears fit together.
Precisely. When you have everything laid out in front of you, you can start to see the bigger picture. You can identify the natural boundaries, the logical groupings, and then start extracting helpers, renaming variables, and so on.
So it's a temporary state of chaos, a controlled explosion, to gain a deeper understanding before you start putting things back together in a more organized way.
Exactly. It's about getting a holistic view, seeing the forest for the trees. But I want to emphasize, it's not about creating a giant, unmanageable pile of code. You do this strategically in small steps, inlining a few functions at a time, testing along the way, and always keeping the bigger picture in mind.
It's a process of iterative understanding, of gradually revealing the underlying structure of the code. But I imagine this technique requires a certain level of comfort with refactoring. It's not for the faint of heart.
It's definitely a more advanced technique, but I think the book does a good job of explaining it in a way that's accessible and approachable.
Okay.
And it's not something you do every day, but it's a valuable tool to have in your arsenal for those times when you're facing a particularly thorny piece of code.
Okay, so we've explored a bunch of specific tidyings. from guard clauses to deleting dead code to this intriguing one-pile technique. We've talked about managing those tidyings within a development workflow, and we've even touched on the economic principles behind tidy first. But now I want to get into the nitty-gritty of software design theory. What makes for good design? How do we measure it?
Excellent. That's where I think the real meat of the book lies. Because, understanding the why behind these tidyings can make all the difference in how you apply them.
Right. So let's start with the big question. What is software design, really? Kent Beck has a very specific definition that I found intriguing.
He does. He defines software design as beneficially relating elements. And that's a powerful concept when you break it down.
Okay, let's break it down. Starting with elements, what are those exactly?
Think of elements as the building blocks of your software system.
Okay.
They can be anything from individual tokens to complex modules or services. The key is that they have boundaries, right?
Yeah.
Where they start and end.
Like the cells in an organism or the bricks in a building.
Exactly. And then we have relating. That's about how these elements connect and interact with each other.
Okay.
A function might call another function. A module might depend on another module. It's the web of dependencies that makes up the structure of our code.
And then the most important part. Beneficially.
Right.
It's not enough to just have elements and relationships.
Right.
Those relationships need to serve a purpose.
Exactly. They need to make the system easier to understand, easier to change, easier to maintain. They need to contribute to the overall quality and value of the software.
So it's not just about design for design's sake. It's about design that adds real value.
Precisely. And that's what distinguishes a well-designed system from a poorly designed one. In a well-designed system, those relationships create a synergistic effect. The whole becomes greater than the sum of its parts.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this ties back to tidy first.
Yeah.
Those tiny tidyings are about improving those relationships between elements.
Right.
Even at a very small scale.
Well, exactly.
By making those relationships more beneficial, we're making the system as a whole more cohesive, more understandable, and ultimately more valuable.
Exactly. And that leads us to two key concepts in software design. Coupling and cohesion.
I've heard those terms before, but I'm not sure I fully grasp them. Can you break those down for us?
Of course. Let's start with coupling.
Okay.
Coupling is about dependencies between different parts of your code, right?
Right.
When two elements are tightly coupled, it means changing one often requires changing the other.
So if I change one function, I might have to make a bunch of changes in other functions that depend on it.
Exactly. And that can lead to a cascade of changes that ripple through your code base, making even small modifications incredibly complex and time-consuming.
Yeah.
It's like a domino effect, right?
Right.
One small change can topple a whole chain of dependencies.
Sounds like a nightmare. So how do we reduce coupling in our code?
That's where those tidyings come in handy again.
Oh.
Many of those small refactorings are designed to loosen those dependencies, to create more breathing room between elements.
Right.
For example, extracting a shared helper function can reduce coupling by eliminating duplicated code.
So instead of having multiple functions all doing the same thing slightly differently, you have one central function that they all call.
Exactly. And this not only reduces coupling, but it also makes the code more concise, easier to understand, and easier to test.
It's like taking a tangled ball of yarn and carefully separating the strands so you can see where each one goes.
I love that analogy. Now let's talk about cohesion.
Okay.
Cohesion is all about grouping related elements together.
Okay.
It's about creating those self-contained modules or components that have a clear purpose and well-defined boundaries.
So instead of having code scattered all over the place,
Yeah.
you organize it into logical units that make sense.
Precisely. And good cohesion makes your code easier to understand, easier to test, and easier to maintain.
It's like organizing your desk, right?
Right.
You put all your writing supplies in one drawer, your electronics in another, so you know exactly where to find what you need.
Exactly. And when you have good cohesion in your code, it's easier to reason about, easier to debug, and easier to modify without introducing unexpected side effects.
So it sounds like coupling and cohesion are two sides of the same coin. We want to minimize coupling between unrelated elements and maximize cohesion within related elements.
Exactly. It's about finding that balance between separation and integration. And it's a challenge, it's a constant dance as we try to create software that's both modular and cohesive.
It's like designing a city. You want distinct neighborhoods with clear boundaries, but you also want those neighborhoods to be well connected with efficient transportation systems and shared resources.
I love that analogy. It perfectly captures the essence of good software design.
Yeah.
And that brings us to another important concept, reversibility.
Reversibility, is that like undo in a text editor?
It's similar, but on a larger scale.
Yeah.
Reversibility is about making it easy to undo design decisions, to roll back changes if they don't work out as expected. It's like having a safety net when you're refactoring or experimenting with new ideas.
Because we all make mistakes, right?
Yes.
Especially when we're trying to push the boundaries of what's possible.
Absolutely. And the more complex our systems become, the more likely we are to make those mistakes.
Right.
So designing for reversibility is crucial, right?
Right.
It gives us the confidence to experiment, to try new things, knowing that we can always go back to a previous state if needed.
So it's like having a time machine for your code. You can always go back to a known good state if things go awry.
Exactly. And there are specific techniques we can use to enhance reversibility, like feature toggles or branching strategies that make it easier to roll back changes without disrupting the entire system.
It's like having an escape hatch in case things go wrong.
Oh.
Okay. So we've explored some pretty high-level concepts here, from coupling and cohesion to reversibility. But I want to go back to that core question. Tidy first. Is it always the right approach?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And the answer, as with most things in software development, is it depends.
I knew you were going to say that. But seriously, when is it the right approach?
Well, the book outlines several scenarios where tidy first makes a lot of sense. For example, if you're about to make a behavior change and the code is a tangled mess, tidying up front can make that change much easier and less error-prone.
So it's about setting yourself up for success, clearing the past before you start building the new feature.
Exactly. But there are also times when it might be better to tidy after making a behavior change. Maybe you're not sure exactly what tidyings are needed until you see how the new behavior impacts the code.
It's like doing a rough sketch before you start painting. You get the general idea down, and then you refine the details as you go.
Right. And then there are times when it might be better to tidy later, or even never. Maybe the code is working fine as is, and you don't anticipate making any changes in the near future.
So it's not a one-size-fits-all approach.
No.
It's about being mindful of the context, the costs and benefits, and the long-term implications of our design decisions.
Precisely. It's about being a responsible software steward, right? Caring for the code base as a whole, not just focusing on the immediate task at hand.
And speaking of stewardship, I'm really curious about the human element of software design.
Yeah.
The book talks a lot about relationships, not just between elements in our code, but also between developers, and even between developers and their code.
That's one of the things I appreciate most about Kent Beck's approach. He recognizes that software development is a deeply human activity and that those relationships have a profound impact on the quality of our work.
So it's not just about writing code, it's about building connections.
Yeah.
Fostering collaboration and creating a positive and supportive work environment.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And those connections can be incredibly powerful.
Right.
When we feel a sense of ownership and pride in our code.
Yeah.
When we collaborate effectively with our colleagues, when we respect the craft of software development, that's when we create truly exceptional software.
It's about bringing humanity back into the world of bits and bytes, recognizing that behind every line of code is a human being with their own thoughts, feelings, and aspirations.
Beautifully said. And that brings us back to another crucial aspect of tidy first, the rhythm of tidying. Remember, it's not about spending hours on end just tidying, but rather weaving it into our daily workflow, finding that balance between tidying and making behavior changes.
Ah, yes, the dance of tidying.
Yeah.
But how do we make sure we're not stepping on each other's toes, so to speak, when we're all tidying in the same code base?
Right.
How do we manage those tidyings effectively within a team environment?
That's a great question, and it's where things can get tricky, especially when you consider, the typical development workflow with pull requests and code reviews.
I can already hear the reviewers groaning. Another tiny pull request for a minor refactoring, come on.
Exactly. And it's a valid concern, right? We don't want to overwhelm reviewers with a constant stream of micro changes.
Yeah.
But we also don't want to lump all those tidyings into one giant pull request that's impossible to review effectively.
So it's a delicate balance. How do we find that sweet spot?
The book offers some practical guidance suggesting that we think of tidyings as distinct from behavior changes.
Okay.
When you're making a change, identify which parts are about modifying behavior and which parts are about improving structure, the tidyings.
It's like separating the ingredients before you start cooking. You have your vegetables, your spices, your meats, all neatly organized and ready to be combined.
Precisely. And then you can start assembling those ingredients into smaller, more manageable chunks. Each sequence of tidyings, even a single tidying, can go into its own pull request. Behavior changes get their own pull requests too.
So lots of smaller, more focused pull requests.
Right.
Sounds good in theory, but how do we avoid getting bogged down in an endless cycle of reviews and approvals?
That's a valid concern. And the book acknowledges that too many tiny pull requests can create their own kind of overhead, leading to context switching and a feeling of constantly being in review mode.
It's like trying to eat a meal one bite at a time. You never get a sense of the whole dish.
Exactly. So it's about finding that balance. A big pull request gives you the full picture, but is overwhelming to review. Teeny tiny ones are easy to review, but you risk losing the forest for the trees.
And we also need to consider the team dynamics, right?
Yeah.
If reviews are slow, it encourages people to submit larger pull requests to avoid waiting, which then slows down reviews even more. It's a vicious cycle.
It is. But there are ways to break that cycle. The book suggests some radical ideas, like eliminating code reviews altogether for those tiny, non-controversial tidyings.
Whoa, no code reviews at all. That seems risky. How can we ensure that we're not introducing bugs in the name of speed?
It definitely requires a high level of trust within the team and a strong culture of quality. The risk of introducing errors has to be very low, and there needs to be a clear understanding of what constitutes a safe tidying.
So it's a powerful option for teams that can pull it off. But what about those teams that aren't quite there yet? What are some more practical strategies for managing those smaller pull requests?
One key is to communicate effectively. When you submit a pull request for a tidying, explain the why behind it. Don't just say renamed variable to be more descriptive. Explain how the old name was confusing, how the new name improves readability, and how this contributes to the overall design goals.
So it's about selling the value of those tidings, making it clear that they're not just arbitrary changes, but intentional improvements that make the code base better for everyone.
Exactly. It's about educating the team, building that shared understanding of why tidying matters and how it contributes to our collective success.
And hopefully, over time, those tidings will become less and less controversial as people start to see the benefits firsthand. But I'm curious about those larger refactorings, those times when we need to make significant changes to the code base. Does tidy first still apply in those situations?
It absolutely does. In fact, the book has a whole chapter dedicated to managing those larger changes. And it starts with the recognition that big refactorings are inherently risky.
Because we're essentially messing with the foundation of the house, right?
Right.
One wrong move and the whole thing could come tumbling down.
Exactly. And that's why the book emphasizes a gradual, incremental approach. Instead of trying to do everything at once,
Right.
break down those large refactorings into smaller, more manageable steps.
So it's like building a bridge. You start with a solid foundation, and then you carefully add each section, testing and reinforcing along the way.
I like that analogy. And the beauty of this approach is that you can integrate those smaller steps into your regular development workflow. You can still submit those smaller pull requests, still get feedback from your colleagues, still maintain that rhythm of tidying that we talked about earlier.
So it's not a separate activity.
Right.
It's woven into the fabric of our daily work.
Exactly.
But I imagine those larger refactorings require a different level of planning and coordination. We can't just dive in and start hacking away.
Right, exactly. The book provides some specific guidance on how to approach those larger changes, from identifying the goals and constraints to creating a clear roadmap and communicating effectively with the team.
So it's almost like a mini project within a project. We need to treat those larger refactorings with the same level of care and attention that we would give to a new feature or product launch.
Precisely. And that level of intentionality is crucial for success.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground here. From the specific mechanics of tidy first to the broader principles of good software design. The economics of tidying, the human element, and even the philosophical underpinnings of this approach. I feel like I have a whole new perspective on what it means to write clean, maintainable, and joyful code.
I'm glad to hear that. And I hope our listeners feel the same. It's been a pleasure exploring these ideas with you today.
Likewise. And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into Kent Beck's Tidy First. We hope this episode has given you a fresh perspective on software design and inspired you to embrace the power of tidying. Until next time, keep diving deep, keep your code tidy, and keep those relationships healthy. Okay, bring on the comment controversy. To comment or not to comment? That is the question.
Yeah, the book's stance is actually quite practical. It's not about dogma, you know.
Okay.
It's about using comments as a tool to improve clarity and understanding. Think of them as a bridge between what the code does and the reasoning behind it.
So not just restating the obvious, like this loop iterates over the array, but adding context that isn't readily apparent in the code itself.
Exactly. The book calls these explaining comments. They're about capturing those aha moments when something clicks in your understanding of the code.
Right.
You know, imagine you're revisiting this code months later, or a new team member is trying to make sense of it. What insights would you want to share? What pitfalls would you want to warn them about?
It's like leaving a trail of breadcrumbs, not just to guide others, but also to help our future selves navigate the complexities we've created.
Right. Those breadcrumbs can be incredibly valuable, especially when dealing with tricky algorithms or performance optimizations. You know, a well-placed comment can save hours of debugging and head-scratching. But the book also stresses the importance of being ruthless about deleting redundant comments.
Because comments can become clutter, right? Especially when they just repeat what the code already says.
Exactly. It's like having a cluttered workspace.
Yeah.
Too much stuff lying around makes it harder to focus on what's important. So the book encourages us to delete those comments that don't add any real value, those that simply state the obvious. It's about keeping the code base clean and focused.
So it's a balancing act. Using comments strategically to enhance understanding, but also being mindful of keeping things concise and clutter-free. But how does this all tie back to those bigger picture design concepts we discussed earlier?
Right.
Coupling, cohesion, reversibility. How do comments fit into that framework?
They play a surprisingly important role. For example, a well-placed comment can help clarify the dependencies between different modules or components, right?
Okay.
Reducing coupling and making it easier to see how the pieces fit together.
It's like adding labels to those tangled wires behind your desks.
Yeah.
Suddenly it all makes sense.
Exactly. And comments also help to define the boundaries and purpose of different modules or functions, enhancing cohesion and making the code base more understandable.
They can act as signposts, guiding the reader through the code base and highlighting the key architectural elements.
Right. And when it comes to reversibility, comments can be invaluable in documenting the reasons behind specific design decisions, making it much easier to undo or modify those decisions later on if needed.
So comments are not just about explaining what the code does, but also about capturing the why behind it. The context, the trade-offs, the thought process that led to those decisions.
Exactly. And that's incredibly valuable, not just for our future selves, but also for our colleagues who might inherit our code or need to understand why things are the way they are.
It's about leaving a legacy of clarity and intentionality, making the code base a more welcoming and comprehensible place for everyone. Now, speaking of intentionality, we've talked a lot about when to tidy.
Right.
That eternal question of tidy first, after, later, never. What guidance does the book offer on making those decisions?
The book emphasizes a very pragmatic approach, weighing the immediate gains against the long-term benefits. Sometimes it makes sense to tidy up front, especially if it will make a subsequent behavior change easier and less error-prone.
Right.
Other times, it might be better to tidy after the behavior change once you have a clearer understanding of how the new code fits into the existing structure.
It's like doing a rough sketch before you start painting. You get the general idea down, and then you refine the details as you go.
Exactly. And then there are those times when it might be better to defer tidying altogether.
Okay.
Perhaps if the code is working fine and you don't anticipate making any changes in the near future, it's a judgment call, a balancing act based on the specific context and the trade-offs involved.
So there's no hard and fast rule, no one-size-fits-all answer. It's about being mindful, intentional, and responsive to the needs of the code base and the team. But how does this relate to that concept of rhythm we discussed earlier?
Yeah.
That cyclical dance of tidying and making behavior changes.
It's all connected. Remember, the book suggests that we think of tidying as a continuous process woven into the fabric of our daily work, right?
Right.
We tidy a little, make a behavior change, tidy a little more. It's a dynamic equilibrium, a constant state of refinement and improvement.
So it's not a one-time event, a big spring cleaning, but an ongoing practice that keeps the code base healthy and adaptable over time. It's like tending a garden. You weed a little, plant a little, prune a little, all in a natural flow that supports the growth and vitality of the garden as a whole.
Exactly. And that's a beautiful analogy because it captures the essence of what we're striving for. a sustainable ecosystem where code can thrive and evolve, supported by a team of mindful and intentional developers.
Well, this has been an incredible deep dive. We've explored the mechanics of tidy first, the principles of good software design, the economics of tidying, the human element, and even the philosophical underpinnings of this approach. I feel like I have a whole new perspective on what it means to write clean, maintainable, and joyful code.
I'm glad to hear that, and I hope our listeners feel the same. It's been a pleasure exploring these ideas with you today.
Likewise.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into Kent Beck's Tidy First. We hope this episode has given you a fresh perspective on software design and inspired you to embrace the power of tidying. Until next time, keep diving deep, keep your code tidy, and keep those relationships healthy.